I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan, and this is the Foreign Affairs Interview.
I think this is going to be a real test of whether what we're heading into is a fundamentally different Middle East or not.
The reality is that we're at a moment in the Middle East, which is like a Versailles moment for Europe, or a post-World War II moment for Europe, that it begs, if you would, for really fresh thinking about what's possible and then, how do you get there?
The Iran war may be coming to an end as Washington and Tehran prepare to sign a framework agreement later this week. That deal should reopen the Strait of Hormuz and end the blockade of Iranian ports, even as it leaves unresolved the issues that brought us to war in the first place, including the fate of Iran's nuclear program. But policymakers in Washington and other capitals are just starting to confront the ways in which the war has transformed Iran and could transform the Middle East. In an essay for Foreign Affairs, Narges Bajoghli and Vali Nasr argue that a new, emboldened generation of Iranian leaders are forging an entirely new approach to their own society, to the United States, and to their own region. I spoke to Bajoghli and Nasr on Monday, June 15th, about what a deal could mean and about how the last 3.5 months of war have changed the course of the Middle East and even of geopolitics more broadly. Narges, Vali, great to be talking to both of you today of all days and to have your essay on Iran's new grand strategy in our forthcoming issue.
Nice to be here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
It is in New York and Washington the afternoon of Monday, June 15th. It's the day after Washington and Tehran announced agreement on a ceasefire that for now at least seems likely to hold. The full details of that agreement are not yet clear. They might not even be clear to people in the U.S. and Iranian governments at this point, and certainly not to the rest of us. And it will not be officially signed until Friday, but again, it does seem likely to hold. I wanted to devote most of our conversation to the path to and from this moment, but I suppose we should first briefly address whether you agree this ceasefire is likely to hold, at least for the next couple of months. Narges, do you want to start on that question?
I think this is going to be a real test of whether what we're heading into is a fundamentally different Middle East or not. If the ceasefire holds, I think that that's the direction we're going into, and we can talk about what that means. If the ceasefire doesn't hold, then it's going to be many more cycles of the same, but the ultimate path is going to be towards a kind of modus operandi that we're beginning to see come about.
Vali, I'm interested if you have any divergence from that basic answer, but then perhaps more importantly, your sense of what follows from this initial MOU or this initial agreement. It ends the fighting, but does not really address any of the issues that were front of mind before the fighting started, whether on the nuclear program or Iran's missiles or proxy networks or anything else, to name just a few things at the top of the American list. How likely are those to get resolved in a meaningful way, or at least to get to some kind of mutual understanding or accommodation in the next couple of months?
Just to add to what Narges said, I think there's a difference between these ceasefire and ceasefires we've experienced with other wars. Namely, ceasefires with other wars are quickly reached and then they are tested and break down multiple times. We've seen that in Ukraine. We've seen that in Syria in the past. This one took a long time to get to this point. So I think in that sense, it's more likely that a lot of the issues have been ironed out. And then the other difference is I think there is less incentive on the part of Iran and the United States to actually violate this ceasefire, this agreement, that it is from the outside. In other words, particularly because Iran has connected Lebanon to this ceasefire, it gives Israel ample room, if it can reject an American discipline here, to actually disturb this ceasefire or at least test this ceasefire. So I would say by no means it's secure. And then that also ties to going forward. I think it greatly depends on how quickly it is implemented and how successfully. I think the most important thing about this ceasefire is that whether it builds trust, particularly on the Iranian side, I think, because they believe that, twice they were negotiating, they were bombed. The US and particularly this president left the deal before. Does he actually implement the US side of it? Do they get any of their frozen assets? Does the blockade actually get lifted in a meaningful way? Does the ceasefire in Lebanon hold? If those things don't really work in a serious way, then it's very difficult to see that a bigger deal could be achieved if this smaller deal cannot be sustainable or credible. If we get actually traction here, then it's more possible to see that at least a serious negotiation on the bigger issues could actually take place.
And do you see scope for agreement on those bigger issues, the nuclear one being the most difficult and prominent?
As a believer in diplomacy, I think everything is possible. But the issue here for me is that we have a very firm understanding of what is it that the United States wants from Iran. We really don't know what it's willing to offer. I mean, ultimately, the difference between a dictate and diplomacy is that diplomacy is about a give and take. Yes, there's a moving scale between what you want to give minimal and what you want to get maximal, but still you have to give something. And it's not very clear what the United States still is willing to offer. And the credibility of whatever carrots it puts on the table is greatly dependent on whether it fulfills the carrots that it's put on the table for the agreement. I think the very important thing for us to think is that this agreement is not just a ceasefire. This agreement is really a big test about whether a larger deal could be possible.
And just to zero in on the nuclear piece of this, the U.S. says no enrichment for at least some sustained period of time, whether that's 10 years or 15 years. Iran has not yet said that it is willing to do that. What is your sense of whether there's possible agreement there?
I think it's possible. It might not be 15 years. It may end up being 7 years. Even the issue of what happens to Iran's highly enriched uranium is still up to debate. Iran has already agreed in Geneva that it is willing not to stockpile anything. And then the other issue, which we often don't talk about, is that the only way to make sure Iran is not actually building a weapon, as far as the West is concerned, is the quality and aggressiveness of the inspection regime. That has to be negotiated with Iran. And suppose I haven't heard much about it, at least in terms of U.S. demands. I think all of these are achievable depending on what the U.S. puts on the table and shows credibility that it actually will deliver on them. So I wouldn't say it can get everything from Iran, but it can get a lot from Iran depending on whether it's willing to actually pay a price for it.
Narges, I'm interested in how you read the focus on the Strait of Hormuz and this agreement as we understand it right now. That is really what was driving both sides to their interest in an agreement at this point, as far as we can tell. But there have been some indications that the definition of opening the strait has gotten more expansive since the strait was first closed by Iran, that the bar for achieving that has gotten lower. And that means that ship owners have probably been quietly paying to Iran, and there may be some kind of fees allowed for other purposes of international law that wouldn't be called tolling, but will in fact be pretty close to it. Is there any clarity on whether those kind of worrying indications have been borne out in the deal as it's taking shape?
I think what we can tell so far from the news that we have and the reporting that we're seeing and the messaging we're getting from all sides is that Iran has claimed and the other sides have agreed to Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. And so what that means moving forward is going to be what Iran decides at different points in time. It's going to be what it's going to use as its leverage back in case certain demands are not met by the United States. Exactly how, exactly when. Again, these are going to be things that now the Iranian leadership has the ability to make decisions over. So I think the way that we have to understand what's taken shape is that this is in many ways Iran's actual deterrence moving forward, much more so than any kind of atomic bomb. And Tehran knows this. It understands that it's now in its hands, and it will move forward knowing that and using it accordingly.
And Narges, what's your sense of what this will mean in terms of economic relief for the Iranians? Again, not all of this is entirely clear, but what are you picking up from the signaling that you've seen? And what is highest on the priority list for the Iranians right now as they look towards rebuilding after this war?
Well, as Vali was saying, the Iranians have had not the best of experiences in dealing with the United States when it's come to deals and upholding of deals on all sides. So I think part of what we're going to be seeing is, again, the Strait of Hormuz, whether sanctions relief actually comes to bear and how long it stays on the books or not, the Strait of Hormuz becomes a tool by which Iran, in effect, makes a lot of the sanctions that are against it de facto not even there. Because if other countries have to deal with Iran, whether it's called processing fees, whether it's whatever they end up calling it, in order to be able to get goods in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, in effect, that means that the U.S. sanctions arm is also being dealt with in a very different way moving forward. So I think that is very much how Tehran is viewing the Strait of Hormuz, both as a strategic thing that it has gotten out of this war, but then also economic leverage.
We'll return to some of these topics, especially, Narges, your tantalizing opening point about the possibility of a new regional order. But I want to zoom out before you get completely sucked into speculation about what the agreement does and does not mean, and go to your fantastic essay in our new issue on Iran's new grand strategy. That new grand strategy was forged partially in response to the perceived failures of Iran around the war last June, but is really solidified since the most recent round of attacks began on February 28th. You note in the piece that at various points that Tehran's old approach, the old grand strategy, had sort of reached its limits or failed in fundamental ways. So Vali, let's start there. What was the old grand strategy? You wrote a great book about this. And what, if you were looking at this from the Iranian perspective a year or so ago, what were the key failures there? What motivated the rethink that really led to the new approach that you two lay out in your piece?
I mean, at the core of Iran's grand strategy is this idea that the United States means Iran's harm, and it's the job of the Islamic Republic to protect Iran and its independence against the United States. I think that has actually been validated in two wars in June and in February. I think the big change then came with the collapse of Hezbollah and the collapse of Syria, that at least Iran's way of managing the United States and Israel basically completely crumbled. It had no deterrence against Israel, and it was in its back heel. Then you had this massive social uprising in January that led to a brutal crackdown. That's the only way that it could be contained. And that led to an assumption outside that the regime is weak internally. It's weak economically. That's why there's a rebellion. The population now has converged on basically a very clear way of wanting to change the regime, and that all you need is to push it off its position. And so they had to rethink exactly how would they do this. And this is actually what we very much focused on, that between the war in June that they survived, and then in February, they had to very quickly come up with an alternative to the strategic tools that they had lost in Lebanon and Syria, to build a missile and drone arsenal that would not basically be destroyed by Israeli American bombing, the way they managed their silos, the way they dispersed it, the way they created redundancies in manufacturing, the way they created supply chain for building their missiles and drones. So they created resilience that way. They reorganized their government as a strategy of survival. And then also as an unintended consequence of the assassination campaigns that Israel carried out in June and then in February, you eliminated the whole leadership in Iran, which basically had thought that it could manage its resistance to the United States within a nice band of no war, no peace. So the old supreme leader looked really angry and aggressive against the West, but he was fairly restrained in how far he would respond to a US attack on Iran, how far he would go. And he had put in place Revolutionary Guard commanders who actually subscribed to that view. They were all sidelined by a generation who believed that the reason Iran got war was because it was restrained. And that actually it had to be unrestrained, aggressive, and take the war to the United States, that the best deterrence against Israel and the US was not restraint, was aggression. As one advisor to Iran's new supreme leader, the new supreme leader said, is that it should not be an eye for an eye. It should be a neck, a head, a whole face for an eye. And in other words, you react disproportionately. So in effect, you saw a complete different approach to war, approach to management of the US, which is far more aggressive. But I would put it on the other side, which is something we raised, that, look, this is also an Islamic Republic that sanctioned the highest level meeting between an American and Iranian since the revolution in Islamabad. And is going to sanction a similarly high level meeting for the signature in Geneva this Friday. So they not only broke the limits that the old supreme leader had put on war, they have also broken the other side of it as well. They're willing to engage at a much higher level. They are willing to do both war and peace, and to use much more aggressive war to get much more out of peace, under the assumption that we don't want to maintain an equilibrium of survival between sanctions and war, because we need to survive as a country, because we need to eat, we need to pacify our population. We have to fight far more aggressively to get a much more at the negotiating table. And so this really is the core of this sort of a new approach. And then, the question is how much this will basically shape Iran after the war and shape the region after the war.
Narges, your essay has been out online for a week or two. There's been response to this framework that you lay out in Iran itself. What has that response been like, and what have you taken from the debate as it's played out among Iranian voices?
Yeah, the article was translated pretty much, the same day that it went online. And it's been circulated through different channels on Iranian social media and by Iranian users on, the international social media sites. And the takeaway so far has been that a lot of Iranians themselves are trying to understand what has happened and what has transpired because everything has happened so fast. And so I think for a lot of folks and what we've seen in the debates is that they are beginning to also see this as a generational shift because their experience of the war has been so different than their experience of everyday life in the Islamic Republic since then. Not just because it was a warlike situation, but also the way that the state was delivering services, also the way that the state was dealing with the population was so fundamentally different that I think from the feedback that we got and that we're seeing, the essay is helping also give language to some of the shifts that they're seeing and helping to understand this generational, like, you know, overhaul that has happened in Iran.
And the war remaking the Iranian state in some sense.
Exactly. Yeah. And because it happened so in ways that nobody expected and in such a short period of time, I think a lot of people within Iran are also trying to grapple with and understand, what has happened.
If we look at the role of nuclear weapons in that whole grand strategy and how that may be changing now, there's, of course, lots of debate about how to interpret the old Supreme Leader's fatwa and the nuclear threshold strategy that seemed to be a part of at least recent Iranian foreign policy. How do you explain the role of nuclear weapons in Iranian strategy, say, leading up to a year ago? And how do you perceive the debates within Iranian leadership about what role they may play going forward?
I don't think that Iran's position has changed on nuclear weapons. First of all, it's too soon. The fog of war has barely lifted for them to be really thinking about a much bigger strategy going forward. But I would say that the debate about nuclear weapons in Iran has become heated. First of all, the purpose of the old Ayatollah's fatwa was not to convince Americans, but actually was to shut the debate, particularly among hardliners who really believe in his fatwa, in asking about a bomb. When he said no bomb, it meant that nobody within the ambit of the Islamic Republic could actually raise this issue. With him dead and the fatwa basically expired, it's now much more easy for the hawks and the hardliners, and I don't say these are necessarily the same people, to basically say that it's time to revisit Iran's nuclear doctrine. And that push is pretty aggressive. But I don't think that there's a decision at the highest level to cross that threshold. And so I do think that Iran is not willing to give up all its nuclear program, but it's the door of using the leverage of the nuclear program in exchange for real economic relief is still open. And it's not just up to Iran to make that decision. It's really up to the United States and potentially Israel as to how they handle Iran going forward, whether they create greater momentum for a nuclear deterrence, or whether they encourage Iran to continue to weaken its nuclear program in exchange for something substantial.
Narges Bajoghli referred to the uprising, the protests in Iran in January and the very brutal crackdown. How should we understand the drivers of those and the regime's response, and not just its very brutal response in suppressing them, but also what it took from those protests, how it interpreted the threat to the regime as it saw it at that time?
The driving force for those protests was the economy and the crashing of the currency in mid to late December. It drove the merchant class out first and foremost, and then they began negotiations with the state. Though, the fact that it began in the bazaars and that started to give hope that this might be a movement that could be very similar to the movements that had started and led to the 79 revolution. And so it also became a moment in which the diaspora community stepped in, and Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former king of Iran, called for people to go out onto the streets on January 8th and 9th, and that's when the massacre happened.
And were those hopes about this being a kind of something on the scale of 1979? Was there reason to think that was true? Was there something to that?
No, there was no reason to think that was true. This was much more of a, how do we up the ante and the vibes around this being a revolution and like drive up the heat. But there was absolutely no, when you're looking at it from a movement perspective, there was no indicators whatsoever that this was a movement capable of overthrowing a state. A revolution takes time. A revolution takes organizing. A revolution takes movement building. It doesn't just come out, one day to the next because people are angry. So it necessitates actual infrastructure building of movements. And what we had in Iran in January, or that moment, it was very similar to other kinds of outpourings of rage that had been happening since the implementation of maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. Maximum pressure sanctions on Iran was an extreme form of sanctions that really throttled the middle classes and the working classes and poor. And it drove people to have extreme amounts of anger at the state for not being able to. Iran is I think in the United States, we don't really tend to think much about, in any complexity about Iran. But when we think about it as an isolated state. The reality is Iran has a lot of oil wealth and other forms of wealth. And the population, for the most part, is used to a particular kind of standard of living. And so that being degraded to the levels that it was under maximum pressure sanctions led to moments of extreme outbursts by the population because of that frustration. But extreme outbursts of frustration over the economy without underlying infrastructure building for movement does not lead to a revolution. It just leads to rage cycles of protesting. The state obviously targeted any kind of organizers on the ground, but the underlying factor is that movement building was not there. So then it became an instance of Reza Pahlavi calling for people to take over government buildings and plazas. And then one of the first instances that we've had in modern Iranian history of a mass urban form of violent uprising. So how the Islamic Republic viewed it was instigation similar to the Syria uprisings and essentially triggering a urban warfare style of uprising that would then lead to civil war. And so that's how the state viewed it. And the reason that it viewed it that way was because it was so intimately involved in what happened in Syria, right? And so it saw that as the blueprint of what the United States and Israel would utilize in order to lead to a similar kind of state and social collapse in Iran. And so that is one of the reasons that the Iranian state chose to confront this in such a violent manner and to massacre thousands of people. They themselves call those 2 days the 13th day of the 12-day war. So they see it as a continuation of the broader war that was happening between the United States and Israel vis-a-vis Iran.
And there is some indication, if you believe the reporting about the conversations between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Trump in January and February of this year, some sense that Washington and the Israeli government also saw that kind of playbook as a viable one. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes, very much so. I mean, that seems to be the conversations they were having. And also it seems to be what Netanyahu was telling Trump, that, look, this is actually our perfect opportunity to do this attack. This is going to be much more similar to Venezuela than you actually thought, because look, they're already on their back heels. They're already falling. All they need is a little push. And in 3 to 4 days, we're going to be out with victory. And obviously they completely misread the situation.
Vali, I'm curious in your reflection on the debate as it played out in Washington or in U.S. foreign policy circles. I think one thing that did influence that debate and that drove a degree of what turned out to be false assurance on the part of the administration was a sense that the predictions about the effects of the war in June had turned out to be overblown, that critics of the war suggested there'd be a kind of immediate rally around the flag effect in Iran, that Iran would react in maximalist ways. And in fact, the results of that June war turned out to be, I think, kind of less dramatic from a U.S. perspective than many of us thought beforehand, and also to do more damage to Iran's nuclear program without precipitating some kind of strategically damaging response from the Iranians. Do you think that's a reasonable characterization of where the debate was here? And is there a kind of need for reassessment of the war last June, now that we're a year away from it?
Yes, of course. Now, in hindsight, that seems absolutely true. And in fact, if in June, the Iranian people didn't rise up to overthrow the Islamic Republic, which in that point, actually, Prime Minister Netanyahu directly called on them to that this is your moment. We've killed all these Revolutionary Guard commanders. You should rise up. in January, where there was the mass uprising that Narges referred to, the Israeli argument was probably to Washington, see, actually the rally to the flag moment has gone. And given that the Islamic Republic so brutally suppressed this uprising, it's now totally alienated its population, and the population is so angry that definitely they would now rise up. And we also know that there were other parts of this that later on became evident, that that the Kurds would invade from Western Iran and occupy territory within Iran. That would then be a sort of a force multiplier against the regime. I think, from the Israeli point of view, the war in June was never finished. They went in to destroy the Islamic Republic, due to it what they thought they had done to Hezbollah, finish Iran off. And in the end, after 12 days, there was a ceasefire. And from Iran's perspective, the war was not over. First of all, the Revolutionary Guards was opposed to the ceasefire that the previous supreme leader accepted, because it thought that the momentum was on its side towards the end, and at least this narrative of Iran having been battered and weakened would not have held if Iran had continued for another week, 10 days in June. And also they thought that Israel would come back, that Israel had not achieved these objectives, it would come back. So both Iran and Israel expected the war to resume. It's Washington that had to be pushed in that direction. Iran tried to dissuade the US from going to war through diplomacy. That's the way in which the old supreme leader worked. There was the Geneva talks. Iran was quite forward-leaning, as we saw later on, in the hope of averting a war. But Israel was more successful in basically making a case for war in Washington. I think what we don't see really a debate is the extent to which the US was being lobbied by both of these. And why is it that the Israeli position won? And Israel was able to both appeal, I think, to the president's ego, and you're going to come out of this like with another Venezuela scenario. And I think Venezuela was pretty important. You will be the president who solved the 47-year-old Iranian problem. And that's why Trump adopted this language that we've been at war with Iran for 47 years. Every American president has failed because he was positioning himself essentially as being the transformative president when it comes to Iran. And also the regime is really weak. It's going to fall. It's not in a position to defend itself. We just need one big push. Now, these days in Washington, these kinds of decisions are made less by a complete system or a complete administration than by one man. So it largely comes down to, how President Trump ended up basically internalizing the messaging that he was getting from Israel, from Iran, but also from other Arab countries who were not favorable of the US starting the war. And when later on we write the sort of story of this war, there are many elements in it. One is, which we try to deal with in our article, is why and how did Iran surprise the US, right? How did the country manage to come out of a narrative of complete defeat in June to force the US to a stalemate? But the other part of it is really the decision-making in Washington. I mean, what set of assumptions led the president to calculate that this could be a 5-day war and that he's going to come out of it with an absolute victory? And then, but because I think what will transpire from here on, both in terms of American outlook on the Middle East and the Middle East outlook, is really internalizing what happened on the run-up to this war.
And Vali, on one of the moves on Iran's part that turned out to be surprising to parts of the administration, though, based on what we know of warnings from the U.S. military and intelligence community, had they been listened to, this should not have been a surprise, was Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Was there debate in Tehran about how and whether to play that card? And were they surprised by the effectiveness of it, the ease with which they seemed to be able to shut down traffic through the strait?
I mean, what you hear is that within the guards, they were not, because they had been preparing for this for a long time. They had created the arsenal of drones and missiles with which to do it. But the surprising part is how the US discounted this and was unprepared for it. So I guess the president thought that the Iranians won't be even there to make a decision to close the strait. And secondly, that they were taken aback with the fact that Iran was not going to use a traditional navy to create a blockade of the strait, but was rather using unconventional asymmetric ways of doing it from the shore. So later on, the president would keep saying, well, we've destroyed their navy. Iran didn't have a navy to write home about at the beginning, and it's immaterial to the balance of force in the strait. And then thirdly was the willingness and capability of Iran to take out so many US bases across the Gulf, in particular the headquarters of the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, that gave them much more capability to do this. I think they had warned us in the sense that even the previous supreme leader had said that if war starts this time, it would be regional. But I think it was misread. That means that there's going to be attacks in Iraq, or the Houthis are going to shoot missiles at Israel, or that whatever's left of Hezbollah may act. And this sort of a direct confrontational attack on the Gulf was not taken seriously, or was not even war gamed in a particular way. One way you can basically justify it is that for 40 years, they dealt with a supreme leader that was risk averse. And so their calculation of what Iran will do, could do, was willing to do, what risk tolerance Tehran had, ironically, they had changed that formula themselves with the assassinations. All of US's war plans would have been probably correct if Ali Khamenei had not been assassinated, and if the generals that Israel killed in June had not been killed. They would be dealing with the Iran around which they had war gained. But they actually ended up creating a new Iran with which they had no experience. I would say it's the surprise of the audacity of Iran more than anything else that accounts for their ability to impose their strategic will on the Persian Gulf.
We'll return to my conversation with Narges Bajoghli and Vali Nasr after a short break. President Trump said yesterday to the Wall Street Journal that I never cared about regime change, and that the new leadership, he calls the third group we've dealt with, is the most rational group yet. We can leave aside the contradictions with his statements around the time the war started about regime change. But focusing on this new leadership group, Narges, Vali set some of this up, but how do you characterize this new generation? Why are they different? What's the change in their worldview? And to the extent that rational is the right way of characterizing them, how do they think about Iran's position and options in a way that's different from their predecessors?
So this generation that's now in charge in Iran is a fundamentally new generation, as Vadi was saying. And I think I want to put a really fine point on this, which is that the founding generation of the revolution is no longer. This is kind of like exactly what happened in China in the late 1970s, where you have the founding generation give way and you have a completely new class of folks coming into the foreground. And what we see from Iran, what we know of this generation, is that this is a generation that for them, proving the worth of the revolution is not their business. The revolution already happened. It happened in their father's generation. The Islamic Republic is here, and especially after these two wars, is here to stay. They are approaching things as defending Iran as a nation, and as a nation that is no longer contained, and is no longer willing to be contained, and is no longer willing to be sort of pushed back into a space in which it will not, in their view, have the heft that Iran is supposed to have in the region. Because this generation, and I think it's key to understand them, is that they fought the United States and Israel. Well, they fought the United States in Iraq, and then they fought Israel and the United States in Syria, and Israel in Lebanon. They have a lot of experience on the ground fighting these forces, which is one of the reasons why they also are bolder when it comes to making decisions. Because not only did they fight these forces across the region, but in many ways they won those places, right? They made Iraq such a quagmire from the United States that it had to get pushed out. The situation in Syria did not turn out the way that the Americans and the Israelis wanted it to, and so on and so forth. So what you have is a generation that is actually not intimidated by the United States. That's definitely bolder. But at the same time, they are not revolutionary like their father's generation was. So they are not trying to export the revolution around, the Middle East or the Muslim world. What they are trying to do is to secure Iran's strategic interests, to make sure Iran is no longer contained, to make sure Iran has a place at the table in the region for sure, and across Asia. And I think we're going to see a much more sort of Iran as a power in Western Asia come about in the aftermath of this. So this generation is a fundamentally new one. It has been trained for decades now within Iran, and their entire social milieu is one in which they have been debating these issues. And in many ways, their ideas, similar to what happens in the United States and lots of other places right now, is that the older generation kept telling the younger ones, it's not your turn yet. These ideas are, like, you don't know it yet. Like, we're still the boomers, we're still calling the shots. And now you have a whole new generation that's coming in. They don't have to deal with their father's generation telling them it's not your time yet. It's their time, and they're going to be moving in that way.
So just a story about Gen X and elder millennials taking power that we'll see everywhere, I suppose.
Exactly.
What about the role of a Gen X supreme leader? How is his role different from his father's? And what sense do we have of his worldview and his ability to orchestrate the system as it exists now after the war?
So Moshe Khamenei, yes, he's a cleric. He's the son of his father. His father, stepped into a role at a time when the Islamic Republic was much more heavily Islamic than anything else, right? And so his father suffered for years from the elders in the clerical world who never really accepted him or his legitimacy, because Ali Khamenei, the father, did not have a lot of religious legitimacy when he was pushed up into that role. He wasn't like his predecessor, Khomeini was, who was very well respected, whether other religious figures agreed with him or not. Khamenei was not like that, the father. But this son doesn't care about those things. Iran is not there anymore. Iran is not more heavily Islamic than anything else. Instead, what is coming to the forefront is, again, this idea of the defense of the nation. And so what drives that is a narrative that comes out of the Revolutionary Guard, which is that they will defend Iran as a nation, and it will be under the umbrella of the Islamic Republic. But the Islamic Republic and Iran, basically what this generation is going to do is they're going to say it is one and the same. These are not separate entities, right? So it's not a project of the Islamic Republic that is currently in occupancy in Iran. They are now basically saying this is one and the same. So Moshe Khamenei is going to not care as much about a lot of the religious debates. That's not his role anymore. Those debates will, of course, continue because, it's as if you're going to say, like, the Catholic Church is going to disappear. Absolutely not. Of course not. Of course, these debates are going to continue in Iran, and they will be social and economic and political back and forths about them. But as far as the state is concerned now, the Islamic Republic under this new kind of generation is going to be one that is, first of all, we can already see it. They don't push back on the cultural issues. Women's hijab is completely gone. Completely. Women are out in the cities and across Iran now with crop tops. No one is batting an eye. It has become socially accepted. The state is actually featuring a lot of these women and girls on state television. They're normalizing this. They don't care. Again, it's like the issues that their father's generation have, they're basically saying a lot of them are actually not our issues. We didn't even like them when you guys were like harassing, our classmates in school. What were you thinking? So those kinds of things are going to be, it won't be perfect, but it's going to be dealt with on a different level. Now they're going to be focused on being a highly technocratic system. Because what has been their Achilles heel is, yes, economic mismanagement and just in general bureaucratic mismanagement. They're going to now be focused on much more like pushing technocratic knowledge and expertise forward and making Iran a functioning state so that it can actually meet their ambitions, which is a strong pillar on the western end of the Asian continent.
I mean, that sounds, if anything, like a version of what MBS is attempting in Saudi Arabia. I mean, this simultaneous, very sharp political crackdown with a lot of opening on social issues and a much more kind of technocratic reformist approach to economics. Is that a similar bargain that both the Saudis and Iranians are making at this point?
In many ways, yes. And again, you can see it generationally in the Saudi case as well, right? And then I think, though, the difference, though, is that Iran has a highly politicized population. And that has a very long history of making demands of its governing state. So that we're not going to see disappear. They will crack down and it will be a repressive state. But Iranian society, everything that we know of it, and this is absolutely not going to change, is not going to stop making demands and being a thorn in the side of the state.
Vali, as you hear that new bargain, that new formula for legitimacy, how likely is it that this Iranian government will be able to deliver on that?
Well, I think they're very cognizant on the fact that they have to deliver on it. In other words, yes, they fought a war. They survived twice between June of last year and June of this year over a 1-year period. But they're also cognizant of what happened in January with the social uprising. End of the day, as Narges said, they want to govern a state. And to govern a state, you ultimately need to build things, construct things. They need to repair the war damage. They need to address varieties of social issues in Iran. Yes, they can bring about technocratic, if you want to call it technocratic capabilities that they've shown in the war, how well they manage the war to the economy. But in the end, how successful they are depends on how much money they have in order to be able to achieve those things. And that's why they're very focused on what they get out of this agreement, the frozen assets, the sanctions relief. And ultimately, they are, I think, open to a big deal with the United States if it actually gives them sufficient amount of economic bandwidth in order to be able to do what they want to do domestically. I mean, look, I think a point that is important about Mujtaba Khamenei, right now, a lot of his legitimacy comes from his father. But in the end, he has to be his own man. He cannot live under that shadow for long. He could claim that he managed the war very well, but in order to become a stable leader for Iran, he needs to be able to govern a society that, as Narges said, is far less Islamic, is far more driven by economic anger and anxiety. And ultimately, I think in his motivation to be a different kind of a leader, because the old model doesn't work. So I think what they can do is greatly contingent on how much economic breathing room they have. And so this agreement, a pathway to the next one, are going to be pretty important to them. The main debate in Iran today, ideologically, is not whether you should deal with the United States or not, because it's, it's infidel or it's somehow religiously abhorrent. The main issue is it worth your time to deal with the United States because the United States is going to cheat you or the United States is not going to deliver? So it's not that you shouldn't talk to the United States on principle. You should not talk to the United States if you think that it's going to not deliver. And if you look, the most hawkish people in Iran, like the commander of the Revolutionary Guard, General Vahidi, was opposed to an agreement until now if it did not actually deliver on frozen assets in Iran. The advisor to the Supreme Leader, a former Revolutionary Guard commander, said that an MOU agreement with the United States is contingent on unfreezing our frozen assets. So yes, they talked about Lebanon. Yes, they talked about a lot of other things. But it's very clear that front of mind for them is the most fundamental thing you need in order to rule a country, which is economic means.
Vali, when I hear Narges' description of the worldview or the sense of Iran's strategic position that this new crop of leaders has, and when you read some of the more sort of triumphalist statements that have come from parts of the Iranian government around this deal, you can understand that sense of triumph in this moment. But it does sound like there's some degree of cockiness or hubris that could, both domestically and regionally or strategically, really look misguided in the next several months, that Iran's position may not be as strong as it seems, just given the reactions from some of the Gulf states that have been attacked in the last couple of months, the continuing role of American power. Obviously, that is not this war has not gone well, but you still have a lot of American military assets in the region and plenty of other threats. Do you see the risk of hubris on Iran's part in a way that could backfire?
Yes, I think the risk of overreach and hubris is always there. Of course, this kind of language that you described was very important in keeping their base engaged, keeping a lot of Iranians who are not even supportive of the Islamic Republic to basically join in the rally to the flag every night in the squares, etc. So they've also created expectations around what they've achieved, which now they're finding it difficult to manage. That's why you saw, for instance, demonstrations in front of the foreign ministry yesterday opposing the memorandum of understanding. You also have military commanders who are obviously quite confident or maybe overconfident in what they have achieved. And I think the challenge for Mujtaba Khamenei is how to be able to manage this exuberance and be able to, I think the big test for him is not that he has brought or the Revolutionary Guard have brought Iran to this point. Okay, that's achievement number one. The more important achievement is, can he translate this moment into something substantive for Iran? Can he translate these strategic gains that they have gained into a new reality for Iran, regionally, economically, vis-a-vis the United States? And I have a sense that, at least reading the tea leaves, that by allowing the engagements that have happened, by allowing his close confidant, the Speaker of the Parliament, Ghalibaf, who was actually very, very personally close to him. I mean, it's reputed that in the old days, he had lunch with Mujtaba Khamenei once a week for decades. And to go to Islamabad and sit one-on-one with Vance, and to go again to Geneva and sign this deal, which ultimately will have his imprimatur, is suggestive that he understands that the military solution to Iran's dilemmas has perhaps reached its limit. You can't keep the strait closed forever. You cannot tolerate the blockade forever. And so if he can translate this into a peacetime gain for Iran, I think that's his preference. And that's also the risk for him. That's because the expectations in Iran that this would be transformative for the country is quite high. That's an expectation that they have created. And if he's not able to deliver, if things fall apart, I do think that, even his position as supreme leader may be fraught going forward.
Narges, what will determine whether they're able to deliver on those expectations? Is that fundamentally about sanctions relief and frozen assets, or are there other key dimensions to this?
Frozen assets are important as a trust building, but it's not, and it is important for them. What's going to be important moving forward is sanctions relief, especially on Iran's oil and petrochemicals, and Iran's ability to be able to access those funds without any kind of interference. And then, setting up some kind of processing fees through the Strait of Hormuz will probably get Iran, upwards of $10+ billion a year, depending on what the charges end up being. It's a good amount, but it's not an amount that's going to keep the economy afloat. So essentially what Iran is important and is going to be sort of moving forward is in similar ways that we saw a bolder Iran on the battlefield. We also are seeing a bolder diplomatic Iran and a more sort of aggressive Iran when it comes to outreach. We've seen that with all of the social media Lego videos and social media memes that they put out. So essentially when I'm saying that Iran is getting out of a containment, or part of what we're arguing in this article is that this is a fundamentally new Middle East, because the Middle East of the past 50 years was built, the entire architecture of it was built to contain Iran. Iran is now out of that. It has maneuvered out of that through these wars. But what we're going to see moving forward is what an uncontained Iran means is it's going to be making a lot more deals with countries around the region, countries around Asia. And in many ways, it's going to try to make moot these kinds of pressures from the United States as well when it comes to some of these sanctions. It's going to be much more engaged on a more peer level with China, especially on trade. And these are the things that they are sort of depending on. And I see them making plans for and talking a lot about as far as how they're going to be rebuilding the country.
And I just want to put a fine point on something you said early in your answer there, which is that you expect that there will almost certainly be processing fees, which we won't call tolls, but will in fact be tolls. I mean, we talked about this earlier, but you put it quite precisely there.
Yes.
Vali, picking up on some of the grand strategy elements of this, so I'm not totally clear as I both try to understand what's in this agreement and then also read your work and the work of others on how some of the key pieces of the old grand strategy are likely to fit into Iran's approach going forward. I guess front of mind for me would be just to raise nuclear weapons again, how they think about their options on the nuclear program. Do they need to retain enrichment capacity? Will they be, trying to do things secretly that inspectors will be looking for? And then the second, the axis of resistance. Do they expect that Hezbollah and the Iraqi militias and the Houthis and perhaps Hamas will be important tools for them going forward? Or has Hormuz and these other kinds of tools that they've developed since the war started really changed the equation as they see it and made both nuclear weapons and the axis of resistance less important than they once were?
I think there's two levels to both of these issues, the nuclear and the proxy. I mean, first of all, these issues, after decades of being forefront of mind in Iran, have now become a political issue domestically. You cannot give up the right to enrichment easily because it's now become an issue of national right. You cannot really see how a government in Iran would be able to sell that we gave this right away after decades of saying this is an inherent right. And similarly, the relationship with Hezbollah, both within IRGC, but more broadly within the body politic that is supportive of the Islamic Republic. And also after, at least since 2023, harping on the importance of a Shia community which is much in Lebanon is much larger than Hezbollah. He's actually suffering because of this war. Basically, it's also a politically difficult issue in Iran. I mean, the thing with proxies is that it's not a clean weapon. You can't just discard it that easily. So there is that political dimension, which would be a challenge for IRGC and for Mojtaba Khamenei to manage as they negotiate with the US. But I think strategically, these things are still tools for Iran, except they're being used maybe in a different way. So I still don't think that Iran looks at its nuclear program completely in a sense that this is a pathway to a bomb that will become a deterrent. It's still by and large something that they're willing to leverage at a negotiating table for something substantial from the United States. I think they no longer view that these proxies are sufficient deterrence against Israel. In fact, the fact that Israel and the US went to 2 wars with Iran without giving a second thought to these proxies suggests that the value that the proxies fulfilled for decades, namely holding Israel's hand against Iran, is no longer there. But that does not mean that they have no value at all. They would have to fit into a completely new war strategy in Iran, which is no longer dominated by the Quds force and its regional capabilities, but by the missile division of IRGC and its drone and missile capabilities. So whatever the Quds force had is of military importance, but not as the premier military importance that it had before. And the missiles and drones matter a lot more. So I think that the role of the proxies in Iran's strategic thinking is radically shifting between the collapse of Hezbollah and Syria to today. But it's not either everything or nothing. It's that just that the way Iran thinks of them as to how they fit into the defense national security approach that they have is different from the past. And similarly with the nuclear issue, I think what Iran understands that even after massive bombardment of Iran's nuclear facilities, the US still, its mind is not addressed with Iran's nuclear program. The president claimed it to be obliterated, and yet it's still on the table. So the question for them is, do they want to spend billions of dollars rebuilding it for it to be bombed again? Or do they want to actually negotiate over it and get something for it? That I don't think has fundamentally changed in reality.
And how do you expect Iran's Gulf neighbors will respond in the months ahead? Obviously, there's been a real divergence, especially between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. But as you look at the regional picture and the regional balance as it appears from Tehran, how might that change, or how has that changed as a result of the war, and what might that look like in the months ahead?
I would say the best way of thinking about right now is that everything in the Gulf has changed. In other words, its view of Iran being a manageable aggressor from their point of view has changed. In other words, Iran has crossed lines with them that you cannot undo now. It's a bigger threat at some level. Secondly, their view of the United States has changed. In other words, the US is not a protection. US bases were supposed to be there since the Carter-Reagan years to protect them against the war with Iran. So the Gulf countries operated on the basis that if you created normalization with Iran, Iran won't attack you and the bases need not be used. And in fact, everything was turned upside down because the US went into an offensive war with Iran, which had nothing to do with the Gulf. And in fact, the Gulf was opposed to it, and they ended up being collateral damage. So the US brought a war to the Gulf and then was not capable or willing to defend the Gulf against that collateral damage. So regardless of how angry they are about Iran, how afraid of Iran they also know that the old model of the protection the US provided is no longer there. So they have to think out of the box. And the answers they're coming up among themselves is actually creating massive fractures among them. In other words, UAE's solution to this is to be aggressive with Iran and invite Israel into a much deeper strategic partnership, which means bringing Israel in a much bigger way into the Gulf, which the Saudis are not comfortable with, or Qataris are not comfortable with, or Omanis are not comfortable with. And in fact, if UAE's plan is to become a military juggernaut by doubly investing in military warfare capabilities, supposedly it's against Iran, but it will be viewed in a threatening manner by all of its neighbors. And so a lot of other issues have come to the fore. And unfortunately, in Washington, I don't see any serious thinking about this. There's a sort of a Pollyannish view that the past would be a prologue. In other words, we just sort of would revert back to having a unified GCC, relying on US bases, and the Gulf will be what it was before. And I just don't imagine it's going to be that simple.
I want to close by returning to the prediction that Narges really started with on the possibility of a transformed regional order. I was struck in listening to Vice President J.D. Vance, especially yesterday, talking about what this deal could mean. He said things like, if the Iranians comply with this deal, it is going to fundamentally transform the Middle East for the next 50 years. This region of the world has been a basket case for my entire life and longer than that. It really sounded like the Obama administration, some of the kind of gauzier predictions from the Obama administration around the Iran deal a decade ago. Narges, if you do kind of take seriously the idea of a transformed regional order flowing from this moment, how do we get there and what does that order look like?
I think what was tested in the past year was essentially the regional order that had been constructed over the past 4 decades, which was, again, a security structure in the Gulf, as you guys were just talking about, and more thoroughly throughout the rest of the region as well, that was there primarily to contain Iran and sort of Iran's allies around the region. If this deal sort of goes through, and what you're stating about J.D. Vance's statements and things like that is essentially an understanding that, as you're stating very correctly, the Obama administration also came to the conclusion, which was the policies of containing a country the size of Iran, with the history that Iran has in the region, with, it makes absolutely no logical sense. And so this idea of full containment only leads to continued conflict throughout the region, and will only continue to do so. What we're going to see moving forward, now the contours of it are yet to be seen. But I think for the first time, we now have an understanding that came about through warfare, unfortunately, which is that the containment of Iran is something that is nonsensical to U.S. national interests, that it only sustains forever wars in the region, and that if we are very serious about ending these forever wars so we can actually think about our real and actual national interests, then we need to have a fundamentally different approach to the Middle East. And so this has now been forced on the battlefield. The question is, can the United States accept this? It seems, at least for now, that this memorandum of understanding is leading in that direction. Obviously, there are a lot of forces across different states that don't want, they've benefited off of the modus operandi being what it was. But the reality is, in the material world, that can no longer sustain itself. So the bigger question is, how long does it take us to get there? And until we can get to a place where the United States is dealing with Iran in the region by having it at the table and actually engaging with it, as well as Iran with the rest of its neighbors, we will continue to see conflicts flare throughout the region.
Vali, let me get your perhaps similarly optimistic sense of where regional order could be going, but also to focus a bit on the U.S. policy options. If you were back in government trying to encourage this kind of transformation, what would you be doing now? What should Washington be doing now to try to get us there?
Well, I think Vice President Vance's comments basically put the onus of the future of the Middle East on Iran abiding by this agreement. But it doesn't show a pathway about, even if Iran did abide by this agreement, how does it get us to somewhere better that he claims would be the case? What I see missing, Dan, is that there is no serious thinking in Washington about what is his vision for a future Middle East order. And then what are the set of policies that is going to get it there? I know you should have a policy after you have a vision. So where do they go from here? Right now, it only looks like they want to get out of this war as fast as they can, and they just put it in the rear view mirror and then leave the Middle East to its own devices. And I think Middle East understands this, whether you're Israel or Saudi Arabia or UAE or Iran, that basically the US has no plans for actually bringing order to the region. And I would say that it has to begin with a realization that the old order is gone. Good and bad with it, it's all gone. As Narges says, you cannot bring it back. And so you have to think about how you will bring a balance of power between Israel and Iran to sustain peace, sort of at least no war situation. How do you restore a kind of a relationship between Iran and its Gulf neighbors that allows the economy of the Gulf to return where it was? And then where do you go from that? In other words, then how do you sort of bring stability to the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinian issue? And then down the road, the biggest piece of this is, what are the mechanisms by which you can put Iran and Israel on a pathway to go from war ultimately to something less, to de-escalation, and then, maybe not in our lifetime, to an actual peace in the region. And none of that actually exists. And the reality is that we're at a moment in the Middle East, which is like a Versailles moment for Europe, or a post-World War II moment for Europe, that it begs, if you would, for really fresh thinking about what's possible, and then, how do you get there?
Well, that is a great charge for our authors going forward and for American policymakers. So that's a good place to leave it. Vali, Narges, thank you so much for the great essay on our new issue, and thanks for doing this today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you for listening. You can find the articles that we discussed on today's show at foreignaffairs.com. This episode of the Foreign Affairs Interview was produced by Rachel Powell, Mary-Kate Godfrey, and Kanish Tharoor. Our audio engineer is Christopher Cook. Original music is by Robin Hilton. Special thanks as well to Arena Hogan. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and if you like what you heard, please take a minute to rate and review it. We release a new show every Thursday. Thanks again for tuning in.